We have arrived at our last panel of the day. Can we have another hand for all of the tremendous speakers so far today? Welcome to the Factory Farming and Fight for Enforcement panel. My name is Lora Dunn. I'm the director of the Criminal Justice Program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. This session will explore some of the challenges to enforcing existing law pertaining to farmed animals, some creative ways that animal protection advocates and attorneys are navigating these hurdles and seeking justice for animal victims, and also what the data is showing us about enforcement on the ground. So I'd like to introduce my esteemed co-panelist this afternoon. Adrienne Craig is a staff attorney and senior policy associate for the Farmed Animal Program at the Animal Welfare Institute. Pete Paxton is the director of investigations at Strategies for Ethical and Environmental Development, a nonprofit organization whose focus is enforcing environmental statutes and conducting undercover investigations at animal facilities. So I know, again, we've heard a lot of information today, but many of us are coming from different backgrounds. So I wanted to take kind of a 30,000-foot view first of what are existing laws at the state level protecting any animal, and then we will drill down a bit as to farmed animals. So, of course, there are animal cruelty laws in all 50 states, DC, and the US territories. And I'll talk first about some general hurdles to enforcement as to any animal. So, of course, as we heard through a number of panels today on legislation on companion animals, that term animal can be defined so differently, right, depending on the jurisdiction. In addition, we see what are called explicit exemptions, of course, for different types of conduct as to animals, and also the location, perhaps, in which those animals are kept. We also see implicit exemptions, or what we call stealth exemptions very often. So terms like unnecessary or cruelly can be undefined by statute and even by case law, and really left very open-ended, a place for industries to be able to hide their practices. Practical limitations to enforcing these laws. So financial resources for enforcing entities, specifically local law enforcement and prosecutors. Very often priority goes to animal victim cases in these offices for a number of reasons. Logistical hurdles as well, right? Capacity for a local shelter, local animal control to actually house animals that might be seized as part of a criminal case. And building something like a temporary shelter might just be beyond the reach in terms of resources. Expertise in animal issues and cases. So often in our work in the criminal program, we see that animal cases are given to newbie prosecutors who maybe have never handled any case before, and they're on the misdemeanor docket, and they get told that they're handling all of the animal cases with all of the different many nuances and challenges that come with those cases, including the fact that we're dealing with live animal victims. And then local attitudes, right, as to any animal, whether we're dealing with wildlife who might be considered pests or nuisances in local culture, and then, of course, farmed animals. So just a bit about my department, the Criminal Justice Program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. We are really a lifeline for any stakeholder who is working in the front lines of animal cruelty casework. So law enforcement, prosecutors, veterinarians, local shelters, courtroom animal advocates, social workers. Our reach is pretty broad and continues to broaden as well. So to that end, we are working on behalf of animal victims to make sure that their cruelty is addressed, and that means getting them out of those situations of cruelty wherever we can. So to that end, we provide training for professionals at the local and national level. In doing so, we partner with national organizations. That includes prosecutor organizations, judges as well. We've done a lot with judicial training in recent years. And we provide that day-to-day case support as well for folks who, again, have just been handed a very thick packet of evidence in an animal cruelty case and simply don't know what to do with it. You heard earlier about the Kyle's case in Ohio. That was one case in which we were really excited to be able to provide an amicus brief to help perhaps push the law forward as to different types of animal victims. We also provide financial grants, again, to plug those holes that I talked about earlier, to help with care costs that can mount so quickly, as well as forensic work, getting expert witnesses to actually testify in trial. Our Collaborative Response Project is a recent program that we launched a couple of years ago, which is a really in-depth support for one jurisdiction that we focus on in a given year. Linda Fielder, who's pictured there, leads that project. She is our investigations manager. And I wanted to point out that in that project in particular, we're looking at not only criminal interventions in these cases, we approach each case individually, again, looking at the best outcome for the animals in the case. We also look at non-criminal interventions. So in the case of that horse pictured above, the caregivers of that horse, we found out we're working toward building a proper shelter through the winter for that horse, but it was not yet completed. So we felt that it would be best in that case to help finances go toward a temporary blanket for that horse rather than pursuing criminal charges. So, building to farmed animal cases, again, many of the limitations in the law, of course, we're all familiar with. Of course, industry often defines different standards that we see in cruelty law for these different exemptions. I have here on the slide, if I can get it to work, there it is, Illinois' animal cruelty statute and the exemption for normal animal husbandry practices. That's something that we see a lot, and of course, that's not defined by statute, by case law, so very often we see the industry themselves deciding what that is. Separate treatment in some cruelty codes as to livestock and non-livestock animals. We can imagine which ones receive a higher level of protection. Mental state requirements in different cruelty statutes, very often as to farmed animals, it's a heightened mental state, so more difficult for a prosecutor to prove as to farmed animal cruelty. Evidence gathering, of course, has been a theme throughout today, and I'll leave that to Pete to talk a little bit more later, but obviously an enormous hurdle to building a case in the farmed animal context. What we emphasize every day at ALDF when we are talking to law enforcement and prosecutors is that farmed animals are protected in the law. Even well-meaning law enforcement who we talk to sometimes simply believe that only cats and dogs are covered in their cruelty statute, again, just given the culture on the ground. So we attack this in a number of different directions through, again, that kind of peer-to-peer discussions on individual cases, but we also produce a number of materials specific to farmed animals, such as our Farmed Animal Cruelty Prosecution Guide. And shout out to Kathleen Wood from our team, who's not here, but she leads that project. And really what we put together is a packet of with this beautiful layout from our comms department of all of the different laws that do apply to farmed animals, some sidebars explaining the different ways in which a statute would apply in a farmed animal case. And again, we've seen just sending these resources around or giving them out at different conferences and trainings can open that door to discussion. Just recently, an office who had received one of these guides years ago, someone else new to the office found it on a desk, pulled it out, called us and said, "This is a great resource, I'm going to use this in my cases." So just again, having kind of that guidance and being there for answering questions. Corporate liability as well, we lay out in these guides. Corporations are not above the law, of course. And again, as we've talked about throughout the day, through other speakers, corporations can, of course, be liable for farmed animal cruelty specifically. More challenging to, for that only to be applicable to a corporation without also pulling in individuals, but we also focus on the corporation where possible. So there are a number of different ways in which cruelty cases come to law enforcement and prosecutors. Traditional ways, of course, a member of the public might make a complaint to law enforcement, then that complaint gets investigated, might go to a prosecutor. There are alternative avenues, especially when it is unlikely that law enforcement or a prosecutor will actually take action in a certain case. And this is where utilizing something like a private complaint can be especially useful in a farmed animal context where these cases can just go under the radar. So since we're here in the Midwest, I wanted to share a recent case that we did in partnership with Animal Partisan. I know Will Lowry is here today, so shout out to him. Will brought this case to us, and we were excited to partner with him and his team on this. So first, a private criminal complaint is, again, an alternative legal avenue toward bringing a case, specifically approaching a court and asking that court to take a next step. That next step might be asking for a warrant to further investigate a case. That next step might be asking a court to actually issue an arrest or a summons for the individuals who we believe should be charged with animal cruelty. So it's an alternative way to more directly kickstart an animal cruelty proceeding outside of those usual bounds. The complaint usually aims to establish probable cause, again, the lowest standard in the criminal system, probable cause that the crime did occur, and the individuals listed in the complaint are the ones who committed the crime. And again, these can be especially valuable in farmed animal cases. So the Minnesota case that I wanted to mention, we filed in spring of this year. This was in the context of Ventilation Shutdown Plus, which many of you may be familiar with. We're not going to show any photos or videos here today, but I will describe, as we did in the complaint, that VSD Plus involves purposefully sealing off airflow to barns containing large numbers of animals and concurrently pumping in heat and/or carbon dioxide, thus forcing the animals' deaths by suffocation and heat stress. So in this case, at a number of different facilities belonging to Genio, more than 50,000 turkeys died over a number of hours. A few, I believe, had to be killed eventually by captive bolt because the very horrific and long process of ventilation shutdown did not quite end their lives. So of course, a huge amount of suffering here. We alleged in this complaint that there was a violation of the cruelty code in Minnesota, specifically for failing to provide a change of air for the enclosed animals. That's pretty self-explanatory. Very significantly, in this state of Minnesota, one of the factors that was important to us is that there's no ag exemption at all in the state, which bolstered our case, we believed. And again, we were asking the court in this case to simply issue a warrant and direct further investigation. There was well-documented evidence of the way that these animals died via this method, so to us it was pretty clear-cut. Unfortunately, the court did decide to deny the application and dismiss this case, but I still raise this as, again, going toward transparency and sharing these stories. This was an opportunity for us and Animal Partisan to spread the word about this horrific practice, to talk about the way that these animals suffered, and for the public, especially in Minnesota, to learn more about this practice that was happening in their area. So I will leave it there. I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne, who will talk a little bit more about specific prohibitions on practices regarding farmed animals.
Thank you, Laura. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here today. And I realize that we are the last people standing between you and the bar and dinner, so thank you for sticking with us. I'm Adrienne Craig, staff attorney with the Farmed Animal Program with the Animal Welfare Institute. Today, I'm going to be discussing on-farm protections for farmed animals at the state level. So a little bit of roadmap of where we're going. First, I'm going to talk briefly about why these laws matter, and then I will provide an overview of the substance of the laws, which can be broken down into three general categories. They are minimum care standards, prohibitions on housing or other specific practices, and sales bans. Later, I will present the results of a survey conducted by AWI that looked at how and to what extent these laws are actually being enforced, and take a brief look at attempts to challenge these laws either through litigation or undo them through legislation. Okay, so let's begin with the why. Farmed animal welfare, as I'm sure you're all aware, in the United States is governed by kind of a patchwork of federal and state laws. At the federal level, protections are extremely limited. They only address transport duration, handling at slaughter, and the housing and handling of animals raised organically. So this leaves the vast majority of animals to only be protected primarily through state laws, which vary significantly in their scope and in their enforcement. So here on the map are those states that have on-farm protections of some kind that we looked at. I should note that the laws that we looked at here are those that were in effect as of January 2023. So there are a few that have been passed or laws that have come into effect since then that are not represented. For your convenience, I have included a QR code to our report. On the second and the third pages, there's a handy chart that lists all of the laws that we looked at, their effective dates, and kind of a quick indication about whether or not there was any kind of evidence of enforcement. The specifics of each of those state laws, what they require, and who's responsible for enforcing them is included in the following 20 plus pages. Okay, so the first category of protections are minimum care standards. So these laws set essentially very basic requirements. Animals have to receive adequate food, water, shelter, and sometimes veterinary care. The legislation establishing these laws typically gives either the state departments of agriculture or specialized livestock care boards the authority to draft and adopt regulations. Some states have fairly detailed standards like Ohio and New Jersey, whereas those in Alaska, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Indiana are pretty bare bones and really only provide a floor of minimum care. One thing of note about the Ohio standards that I think is important is that it mandates a periodic review of the rules by a livestock care standards board that is required to consider, among other things, advances in animal welfare science. Some states empower agriculture departments or boards to impose civil fines or issue orders for violations. Other states like Indiana and New Jersey, it's the state agency that has investigatory powers but has to refer violations to law enforcement. And then lastly, in states like Louisiana and West Virginia, it's local law enforcement that typically handles investigations and ultimately prosecutes under either state neglect or existing cruelty statutes, if at all. Okay, the next type of protections are those that are establishing housing standards or ban-specific practices. We're talking about gestation crates for pregnant sows, battery cages for egg-laying hens, veal crates for calves. This also includes tail docking for dairy cattle and force-feeding ducks and geese to produce foie gras. So these laws have come about often through ballot initiatives led by animal advocacy groups. So California's Prop 2 and 12 and Massachusetts Question 3 are examples of those. Other times they are passed through legislation or in the case of Arizona through their existing power to regulate egg standards. Somewhat surprisingly, the first state to pass a prohibition of gestation crates was Florida back in 2002, which may have been the last time Florida did anything amazing. No offense to anybody from Florida here. So the last category are sales bans. So they prohibit the sale of products like Specifically pork, veal, eggs, and foie gras that are the result of production systems involving particularly egregious confinement practices or force feeding. The important thing to note about these laws is that they apply regardless of where the product originated. So that means that out-of-state producers have to comply if they want to access that state's market. These laws also have come about through ballot initiative often, but sometimes through legislation. And the sales bans, like all of these other laws, kind of vary in how they're enforced. So some states like California, Colorado, Arizona, they take a proactive stance. They require producers producers and distributors to demonstrate compliance before products are sold in the state. And others like Massachusetts and Oregon mandate that producers or distributors maintain records proving compliance, but they only need to provide that evidence if a complaint arises. Washington is kind of an odd outlier where they require something akin to an affidavit, which requires distributors to acknowledge that they understand that compliance is required, but doesn't actually say we are in compliance or that we need any kind of proof. Okay, so like I mentioned, again, the survey was of laws that were in effect as of January 2023. These are the states that have since passed on-farm protections that have come into effect, that have either passed or had protections come into effect after the survey period. These will be included in our next iteration of the report. So how well are these laws being enforced? Is it good or is it bad? I'm sure you can guess. So this information that I'm about to present is based on public records request and is the second of these surveys done by AWI. The first was released in 2019. It covered 16 states. And the second, which I'm talking about today, expanded to 18 states covering 44 provisions of law. We submitted the public records request to cover the period between September 2019 and January 2023. I chose the first month of 2023 because there were a couple laws that came into effect as of January 1st, so I wanted to try to capture any in their initial stages. Out of 44 state laws, we received evidence of enforcement for 12, which is not great, but the laws that had the most consistent enforcement activity were minimum care standards. So Ohio and New Jersey produced the most records and showed the greatest number of enforcement actions. Ohio stood out specifically because it issues notices of violations and it pursues fines. New Jersey stood out in particular because the Department of Agriculture has a written procedure to follow up after violations to ensure that corrective action has been taken. The lowlights, Kentucky, West Virginia, Kentucky specifically because they don't enforce the care standards at all. And in fact, when I inquired about the lack of records, I was told by a representative of the Department of Agriculture that they were quote unquote made to write those and that nobody follows them. West Virginia is an interesting case because in our first survey, they actually produced quite a few responsive records, but this time around when we went to request them, after we released our last report, the West Virginia legislature specifically passed a law exempting those exact records from public disclosure. So we just don't know. Okay, based on an evaluation of the states that do these laws well, we can draw a few conclusions about their strengths and their weaknesses. Their strengths, they can and do provide some measure of protection for farmed animals that are independent of the state's cruelty, criminal cruelty statutes, which Lora talked about earlier. They can lend an agency authority to investigate, which usually includes the authority to enter production premises. The laws can be written in such a way, as in Ohio, like I mentioned, that they need to be updated as welfare science progresses, so you are not running the risk of entrenching outdated and harmful practices. The weaknesses are, foremost, that they are mostly complaint-based. These laws are not designed to create an auditing system, and that means that investigations only happen if somebody complains, which leads to the second weakness, which is that large-scale production is largely invisible. We don't see the majority of animals that are produced for consumption in this country, and it's really hard to make a complaint about treatment of animals that you can't see. And finally, the last weakness is the laws often give discretion to the agency whether they want to issue warnings or civil fines or refer the case to law enforcement. So in evaluating the text of these laws and their implementing regulations, we get some idea about how they can be drafted in a way that increases their effectiveness. I think most importantly to avoid the downfall of the care standards, for example, in Alaska, where the records show a large amount of confusion over who actually is responsible for them, whether it's local law enforcement, the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture, or in Kentucky, where there's not an obvious, clear enough mandate for the Department of Agriculture to enforce those standards. Okay, next looking at housing standards or bans of specific practices. Of the 30 laws, there were records of enforcement of 2 of them. Ohio's tail docking ban was one of them, which is actually incorporated into its minimum care standards, and Colorado's hen housing standards. I have a couple of ideas as to why that might be the case and why there appears to be such a lack of enforcement. First of all, a lot of these laws have been in effect for several years. So at the beginning of this latest survey period, 6 of the gestation crate bans had been in effect for at least 4 years. Producers seeking to establish new production facilities in that state are likely already aware of those prohibitions. Second, some of the laws and the supporting regulations don't require any kind of proactive auditing. They are essentially complaint-based. And much like the issue with livestock care standards, again, the majority of animals that are raised for consumption are kept indoors. Third, some states just don't have a significant amount of production of that particular animal. So for example, Florida and Colorado have both banned gestation crates, but really neither of them have a significant pork industry. Nevada has no egg producers that meet the number of chicken threshold for them to be subject to that state law. So it's no surprise that there were no records. Lastly, they have no mechanism of enforcement. No agency or entity is tasked with enforcement. So for example, the Florida gestation crate ban is in the Constitution, which doesn't really indicate that there's anybody, apart from, I suppose, the entire executive branch of that state, to enforce it. But we have also seen in other cases that agencies really just misunderstand or choose not to exercise their authority. Lastly, but not least, sales bans, which are the laws that have had the greatest amount of pushback because they can and do have effects outside of the state with the ban, especially if that state internally does not have a lot of production. Of the 9 laws prohibiting the sale of certain products, there was evidence of enforcement from 4 of them, all of which were prohibitions on the sale of eggs from hens in battery cages. I don't remember putting those question marks up there, but why? I'd note that because of pending pending litigation at the time during the survey period, California, which we all know has one of the most influential of these sales bans, they had allowed their producers and distributors to self-certify during that period, so that explains why there was no records from California. But we know at least under the letter of the law and the way that the California Food and Agriculture Department is actually going to require third-party certification or audits in order to prove compliance. Massachusetts sale ban was also subject to litigation, which in addition to their complaint-based model, probably it could explain the lack of records. Okay, so I'm going to quickly discuss the challenges to these laws because they also contribute to the lack of enforcement. Specifically, the challenges have come in the form of litigation and state and federal legislation. As far as litigation goes, you may be familiar with some of these cases, but just kind of rattling them off. So California's Prop 2, which was the in-state battery cage ban, or the law actually required that hens have enough space to stretch their wings without touching either side of the enclosure. That was challenged for unconstitutional vagueness in 2008. That case was dismissed. California's foie gras ban has been challenged over and over and over again, the latest of which ended, unfortunately, with the court allowing online sales of foie gras to Californians. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is aware of the challenge before the Supreme Court of California's Prop 12, and that was based on Dormant Commerce Clause claim. Massachusetts Question 3 was challenged on similar grounds, as well as on grounds that it's preempted by the Federal Meat Inspection Act. A small portion of that law was struck down by the court, but the remainder is in force, and I believe maybe last week there was a recent decision that was affirming the lower court's decision in that case. And most recently, the Department of Justice brought suit against California, specifically regarding its standards for eggs, arguing that the law burdens interstate commerce and conflicts with the Federal Egg Products Inspection Act. Regarding legislation, on the federal level, there has been a concerted effort to pass legislation that would preempt these state laws. We heard about it earlier, so it's first titled the King Amendment way back in the day, recently called the EATS Act, or a new iteration is the Save Our Bacon Act. This legislation would, in effect, prevent states from enforcing stricter animal welfare, food safety, or agricultural regulations on products coming from other states if those standards are beyond what the federal law or the producing state requires, even if there are no requirements. So the act is often characterized as a marker bill, meaning that it's a proposal that's intended to be inserted either fully or in part into a larger omnibus bill. We know how often Congress passes standalone bills. Not often, so they put it into the Farm Bill, and as we heard earlier from Alicia, that there are many groups that are working to try to prevent this from being included in the next Farm Bill. As far as state legislation goes, there have been some efforts aimed at undoing the laws, specifically those requiring the sale of cage-free eggs. The primary justification for these laws being, of course, egg prices are too high, and a drop in domestic production resulting from the mass killing, often through ventilation shutdown plus, of millions of egg-laying hens and pullets and breeder birds due to avian flu. Legislation has been introduced in Michigan, Colorado, and Arizona to fully repeal those states' cage-free egg laws. Happy to report that those all failed. However, Arizona, the cage-free egg requirements were initially supposed to go into effect in 2025, but they were delayed by administrative order until 2026, again, because of egg prices. And lastly, in Nevada, recently there was legislation that was enacted to allow the temporary suspension of the cage-free regulations for a limited period. I think it's up to 120 days during an emergency or market disruption. Okay, takeaways. So across the board, we identified some recurring barriers to enforcement, which were the lack of proactive mechanisms, the reliance on complaints, and limited agency authority or willpower. Based on those, I'll conclude with what might be considered my wish list for overcoming these barriers, with the caveat that I am absolutely mindful, as was discussed earlier in the panel about local and state legislation, I'm absolutely mindful of the fact that in order to get these laws passed, especially through state ag committees and the legislature generally, you have to make sacrifices. You can't always have the perfect law, and there are considerations beyond exactly what's in the law in order to get those passed. But wish list. For minimum care standards, the key is making them clear, enforceable, and science-based. So that means requiring basics like food, water, and shelter, and veterinary care, but also prohibiting practices that have shown to be significantly detrimental to animal welfare, or addressing aspects of care like pain relief for routine alterations. Agencies, they need clear authority to be able to inspect farms, issue penalties, and require follow-up after violations. The standards should also be reviewed regularly to keep pace with evolving animal welfare science and veterinary practices. And importantly, the boards that draft the rules should include veterinarians and animal welfare experts and not just industry voices. For laws banning specific practices like gestation crates and tail docking, there is a need for an active enforcement mechanism, so not relying on complaints. In some cases, states should require the producers to register with the agricultural department and provide annual proof of compliance that is verified by inspections or third-party audits. For sales bans, similarly, focus on verification and accountability. So agencies should require proof of compliance before the products enter the market rather than, again, relying on complaints. Third-party certifications can be very helpful here, but the approved third-party programs should be independent and they should use unannounced audits. And something that is true of any of these standards, my final wish is that the penalties for violations need to be significant enough that the companies and the producers don't treat them as yet another cost of doing business in this area. And that is all from me for now.
Test one, test two. Y'all hear me okay? All right, it's almost time for cocktails. Not yet. I'm a walk and talk guy, so I'm going to walk and talk. I'm Pete Paxton, Director of Investigations of Seed. Since 2001, I've done undercover investigations of factory farms, slaughterhouses, commercial fishing boats, and puppy mills. I'm going to share some knowledge with you from my experience about the number one thing standing in the way of enforcement of cruelty statutes. This thing will also determine if you even need a cruelty statute enforced to reach your goal. I'll explain. How you can present a case to maximize your chances for getting the law enforced, and a strategy shift that we can make if we want the long-term goal of the law being enforced for all animals. But first, I want to tell you a story. It's about this hog farm I worked at. This was back in the day. I worked for a group called Mercy for Animals. I was working at this hog farm called West Coast Farms. It was in Oklahoma. The owner was from California. This story is already confusing, but I'm going to keep going. So first, I got to get hired, right? It's a farrowing farm, right? They got gestation, farrowing, and there's all kinds of abuse that goes on there, so I want to get hired. I'm talking to the owner on the phone, and he's sweating me down, right? Asking me all these questions. He's like, "You're not an undercover investigator, are you?" And I'm like, "No." And he's he's like, and then he tells me, he goes, "Well, listen, I don't tolerate abuse at my farm." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And he goes, "If someone abuses an animal at my farm, I'll call the cops on them." And I'm like, I've got to work at this farm. This could be the one farm I've ever worked at where no one breaks the law. So I get hired, and I start working at his farm. And it turns out he was a fucking liar. There's all kinds of abuse that's going on. There's, people weren't thumping piglets correctly, leaving them alive. I found a live pig in a freezer. People were beating hogs that were confined just to vent their frustration. And there was this sow. She comes out of a gestation crate, and she's down. She can't stand. So they're punching, they're kicking her. A worker's jabbing his finger in her eyes. She won't stand. Now, the owner's not present for all this. So I know what my move is, because I want to get something on the owner. Now, let me just tell you something real quick as an aside. I've worked a lot of cases, and I've seen cases go every which way. Let me just say real quick that when it comes to the workers, I've been responsible for a lot of prosecution on a lot of workers, but 90% of the workers in these farms, they're undocumented immigrants. They're doing jobs too difficult for most of us to comprehend. And they're tired, they're exhausted, they're stressed. A lot of the abuse they do, it's because they don't want to lose their job, right? They get angry, and they're doing something that, even though it's illegal, they see everybody gets away with it. It is culturally appropriate to do that kind of abuse. And then they get thrown under the bus of enforcement. And animal agribusiness says, well, they're just some bad apples. And now we're in an age where ICE is brutalizing them, tearing families apart, wants American culture in general to view them as less than human. So, and this was before we're dealing with anything with ICE, but I thought, okay, I got an opportunity here with the owner. I want to get something on him. So I meet with him, and I'm like, hey, man, we got a Down sound gestation. I just want you to know, man, listen, they tried everything to get her up. I mean, they were punching her and kicking her and jabbing fingers in her eyes, and goes, no, that's cruelty. We can't have that. They can't be sticking fingers in her eyes. I'm like, oh, okay. So I wait a couple days, having lunch with the guys at the farm. I'm like, hey, the owner talked to y'all about abuse? Has he been talking to y'all about this, about how we, handle the animals? And they look at each other, they look at me, and they shake their heads, and I'm like, are you serious? I'm the only guy he's griping to about abuse, and they all laugh. Now, a case that I'd worked just before that at a calf ranch in Texas, I got something similar. The owner of that calf ranch, Kurt Espenson, I said to that guy, I was like, hey, man, we got live calves in the dead pile. You want me to mess with that? No, I don't give a shit. Boom, Kurt Espenson got convicted of neglect. There was a cruelty charge on him for that. Before that, I worked at an egg farm in Maine, right? Live hens in the trash cans. I show the owner, hey, man, we got live hens in the trash cans. Do I need to count that any certain way? No, I don't give a shit. Boom, 10 civil counts of animal cruelty against that company. 6-figure fine, right? $125,000 fine. So, we got this evidence. It's locked and loaded. Going to meet with the DA. Raise your hand if you have not heard of the West Coast Farms case, if you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. Leave your hand up leave your hand up if you think the owner was convicted of cruelty. Who thinks? Okay, nobody thinks that. Who? Okay, yeah, you think so. All right. Who thinks the farm was shut down? Guess what? He was not convicted, sure as hell wasn't even arrested, and the farm was shut down. Here's how it went. Go into the DA's office, and she's got framed pictures of hog farms on the wall, right? Like aerial shots on the wall. She doesn't even want to look at the evidence, doesn't care. It is the only time in my career I have laughed at a prosecutor in a meeting, and I have no regrets about that. She didn't care about the public pressure that came afterwards from the press, but Tyson did. This was a Tyson contract farm, and they pulled the contract. The reason that the DA in Henrietta, Oklahoma, didn't give a damn about the cruelty is this, and the reason that Tyson felt they had to and pulled the contract is the number one reason if you'll get enforcement or not. That reason is culture. There are exceptions, but just because there's exceptions doesn't mean there's not a rule. Culture is the number one thing that determines odds of enforcement. What we do, and when I say we, I'm including myself because this is my job, we go to places and we film people without their knowledge, right? Doing things they don't want anyone in the world to see at their farms. Farms, by the way, that they work so that they can raise and feed their kids. Like the farms their parents had. Like the ones their community has. Like the ones the government rewards them for having with tax subsidies. Like the ones that the Bible says that for working with their hands, they are godly. And then we say, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. The community's wrong. It all needs to change. By the way, we filmed you and we're putting it online. Yeah, no shit, the cops aren't enforcing the cruelty statutes in places like that. Doing so is a cultural threat. Most of the laws that involve animals, farm animals, they're anthropocentric. They view animals as resources. How do you abuse a resource? And what are cops told is the number one reason why they should be concerned about animal abuse? Raise your hand if you know. Who knows? Somebody here knows. The number one reason cops are, yeah, well, what do we got, Adrienne? Because there's a correlation between the abuse of animals and the abuse of people, right? But what if it's not for these places? What if at these broiler farms, these egg farms, these dairies, these hog farms, what if they're filling your community and the people that run them aren't hurting people? They're not abusing their kids. The cops never get called on them. Is what they're doing actually cruelty? Or is it just part of the job? You want to bring a case to them and have them look at it in a different way. You have to get them to see you as one of them. I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that. My first tip is going to sound a little silly. You got to dress for the occasion. I understand this is hypocritical coming from a guy who is presenting at a conference in a Slipknot hoodie, okay? But I can't tell you how many times I have gone to go, like, okay, listen, I meet with sheriffs and I meet with DAs and all this, and almost inevitably, button-up shirt and jeans. And here comes the animal rights attorneys. Suits, ties, right, walking. They look at you and they're like, you have never worked a farm a day in your life. You don't know anything about this. Dress down, y'all. Dress down. Now, the next tip. Who has experience with animal rights cases, bringing them to DAs, bringing them to sheriffs? We got anybody? Experience? Nope. Okay, so this is a very, okay, yes. Okay, so this is a common thing animal rights groups like to do. They go and they're going to go to the DA, and what do they bring? The binder, right? It's the binder for the case. And they're like, all right, it's this massive thing of all the information on the case. They're like, okay, we got the full case, and we defined all of the laws for you because you don't know them. You're too dumb. And we defined animal because, again, right? No, they don't like that. Now, listen, I understand if it's kind of ambiguous and you want to say to them, listen, I'm not trying to condescend you, okay? But this is a little bit ambiguous, but we're sure that the law was broken, so we found all of the case law to show it to you. But in general, they find it condescending that you think they don't know the law and that you don't know how to apply the law. My best success lately has been with Seed. I just make a one-pager. One page. It includes pictures. Right? I take stills from undercover shots I took. I put it on there. I describe, this is who I am, this is what I did, and I use shorthand to explain the statutes that I think were violated. I email that to law enforcement, and I'm like, all right, I know you're busy. Get to me when you can get to me. I got to take off in the field anyway. Had great success with that. I had one case I did a while ago for a group. It was a dog neglect case, and I was like, all right, let me know what you need. I got all this evidence and all this, and the sheriff's deputy was like, I don't need your evidence. He looked at the report, drove up to the target, and was like, yep, dogs are being neglected. Immediately asked the DA to file charges. Dogs are rescued. Guy was arrested and convicted. Done. I had another case I did for Seed recently. Send out the one-pager. This is what's going on. I have a lot of evidence. I have all this evidence, right? Dozens of videos, all these photographs. I got massive reports. Do you just want the relevant stuff, or what do you want? I get in touch with a cop, and he says, send me the relevant video footage of these particular violations that you're talking about. I get that to him, and a detective calls me. And this is what you're most likely to find on a case. The detective calls me, and he's like, all right, I want you to send me everything. And I said, okay, cool, but can I ask you why? And he said, I want to make sure you weren't doing something you shouldn't have done. There it is, the culture conflict, right? I came to him and said, I found violations of the law. I am assisting you. And his first thought is, you must be a criminal, right? And so what I did was, I sent him everything. The shots where I accidentally let the cam running too long, and it's just 10 minutes of me working at the barns, right? The photographs that are too fucking blurry and you can hardly see some, all of it, all the reports. I recommend you do that, not just because you want to capitulate. You want them to see you as one of them. You want them to see, this person did the case like I would do the case, right? They focused on everything and they honed in on criminal activity too, right? The report is very professional. All of the evidence is organized well. They will get over their bias, especially if you tell them, I have no plans on going to local press anytime soon, right? You give them a minute to work the case, right? And then they ask, are you willing to testify? And I'm like, yeah, my policy on testifying anywhere, anytime, right? Didn't hear back until the guy was convicted. They didn't even need anything from me. Nothing else. Just boom, dude's convicted. That was it. I think what helped me on that case, and what's helped me on others, is that I made sure that the cops had access to all the evidence. I also gave them access to me. What I'm about to say, this is a room full of lawyers, and I know a lot of y'all may disagree with this. I can promise you that when you leave here, there's going to be a bunch of lawyers that are going to be like, hey, that Pete guy? No. Okay? No. Don't do what he said. But I'm going to tell you right now, If you, if you want to maximize the chances of enforcement, unless you have reason to believe the cops are corrupt. I've dealt with corrupt cops. I've been illegally arrested, wrongfully convicted. I've had all that happen. You feel that out, right? But if you don't have reason to believe that, I recommend give the police access to the investigator. Give them the investigator's cell number. If your investigator cannot explain what they did on the case, they shouldn't be an investigator. All they have to do is to talk about what they did. If every time the cops have to talk to your investigator, they have to go through a lawyer, it looks suspicious. I don't care that that's wrong. I don't care that that's unfair. You have to think like a cop. It just looks bad. Make sure they have access to that investigator. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is a strategy shift that I think the movement needs to make if we want to see increased enforcement, because times are changing, and we have to change with them. And I've had a lot of luck with enforcement on recent cases. I've also had problems on recent cases. Before I tell you what I think we need to do, I'm going to give you an analogy. Bear with me. Anybody here have any martial arts experience? Oh, yeah, okay, all right, we got a couple people. 3. All right, it's 3 times more than the last time I tried something like this, okay? This is great, all right. So a while ago, I'm at this class and I'm sparring a guy, and I'm getting my ass kicked, okay? He's just pummeling me. Like, I can't stop his fists from hitting me, and I cannot tag him, right? And so I told him, I was like, man, like, I can't hit you. Like, I can't see what you're doing, and it's like you're reading me like a book. You're all over me. And then he says, as he's hitting me, you just need to slow down, right? And I'm like, what? You know, and then he repeats it. He's like, you just need to slow down. Now, it does not seem that, like, while in the middle of taking fist to my face, the best thing I could do was slow down, but nothing else that I had done worked. So I took a step back, kept my range, slowed my breathing, and decided I'm going to slow down. And then it happened. I had been trying to force the fight. I had been trying to make something happen, get him where I want him. I should have just been going wherever the fight took me. I should have not been seeing what I wanted to see. I should have been seeing what was there. And then I started landing hits. I started blocking some of his hits. I still got my ass kicked, but I learned something, and it helped me for the next fight. This is how it applies to us. We are in an era right now where women are losing bodily autonomy. Younger voters don't believe in democracy as a valid form of government. Science is being buried under our service to faith, which amounts to environmental deregulation. And in the midst of this, the animal rights movement is hanging on to a numbers-based strategy that does not take culture into account. We need to slow down. I know that the fight is not where we want, but we have to see it where it is. That means if we want enforcement, groups may have to diversify the targets they go after. We do need to do cases on the largest numbers of animals, but groups also need to get enough enforcement cases under their belts that they can expect law enforcement to take them seriously. If we want a future for the animal rights movement, it has to be one where law enforcement and our government institutions respect us, are willing to listen to us. And to do that, we have to prove that we're on their side. We're on their side when it comes to the law. We're on their side in the pursuit of justice. The easiest animals to do that for are companion animals. You take a step away and you start going towards hogs, cattle, sheep, and goats. You move further out and you get, unfortunately, to chickens, fish, and shrimp. And we need to be helping them. And we need to be working on enforcement for those cases. But before we reach the point of the fight that we want, we have to see the fight that we're in and move accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete and Adrienne. So before we turn it to questions from the audience, we were hoping to have some discussion up here amongst ourselves, and I'll ask this of both of you. Given where we are right now, and as both of you laid out, there are challenges and hurdles, what do you hope to see from future efforts in the near term for on-farm protections in particular? Adrienne, we can start with you.
Yeah, so I think that I'm going to go for a wish list rather than practicality, although I know that obviously culture is a huge part of it. And I understand that getting laws passed is an uphill battle generally, so it's not incredibly practical to ask for the moon, but I would really love to see laws that take into account more than one aspect of animal production. So most of the recent laws that we have seen are banning extreme confinement because that's something that we can relate to, not wanting to be extremely confined. But I think that that's, and I don't think, I know that that is only one small aspect of animal welfare. So I would like to see laws that discuss bedding, stocking density, flooring, growth rate of animals. And I think that this is where the care standards can come into play because they can be a little bit more detailed. Plus the fact that, it is a common, I think, criticism or a point that's made by industry folks that our only goal is to put farmers out of business. That's all we're trying to do is just make their lives difficult, and we don't want people consuming animals. If we're talking about, as much as we don't want to focus on numbers, care standards can, I think, when they're coming from, as much as people balk at being told what to do, especially in the United States, is we just don't like being told what to do. Having care standards that are established by the state departments of agriculture, I think, are a good way to start changing the culture. And they're not talking about, okay, this is cruelty, you're doing something cruel. But we are saying that this is a standard of care that is accepted by the animal welfare scientist community, not the animal rights community. I would like to be very clear. I'm from the Animal Welfare Institute. Our focus is on welfare. We want to reduce the amount of suffering. And I think that, what I would like to see is more minimum care standards and those that address more aspects beyond just extreme confinement.
Yeah, what she said also. Well, one thing I'd like to see in specific is that there's a lot of statutes where they talk about, unnecessary cruelty, right? As you mentioned, they don't define it. So I would like to see some things like where, you note that there's some things you specifically can't do, but the wording has to be careful in the law so it doesn't indicate then it's okay to do anything else, right? Like one thing, a very common thing I see is sheep, goats, hogs, cattle, using cattle prods to move them, aiming for the eye, the mouth, the vagina, and the anus. That's like a very specific thing. And so like if it was just a law that says that, it's not, you cannot do anything unnecessary or cruel in any other part of the body, but specifically under no, in no situation can you shock an animal in the, eye, mouth, vagina or anus. I think that like that would, like half the stuff that I see when it comes to livestock, you'd have clear violations immediately. So specific things like that,
And that's always a balance, right? Legislatively, going back to the panel that Alicia moderated earlier, is to what level of specificity do we as advocates in this space, do we want to actually prohibit certain conduct, then potentially at the exclusion or, kind of implying that there's some kind of tiered, this is worse than another kind of cruelty.
Yeah. And USDA inspectors at the kill spot would be fucking great.
Yeah.
Following up with you, Adrienne, about what you touched on earlier, given that we are seeing a lack of enforcement in your report, do you think that it's worth that all of the time and effort that goes into passing these laws? As Pete said, there can be cultural impacts as well. Would you want to see folks putting their time and attention into other areas or other types of laws? That's a big question, but do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do think that these laws are worth it, even though, I mean, I think as a practical matter that they address a very small aspect of animal welfare. I think that, for two reasons. One, you're getting the issue in front of policymakers, and that people who maybe are not familiar with how their food gets to their plate, and the more even challenges to these laws bring publicity. That, for example, the Prop 12 case that went up to the Supreme Court, everybody was wondering not everybody, those who are nerdy enough to follow what the Supreme Court does is wondering, what is a gestation crate? What is this about? I will look into it more. And then of course they Google it and they're like, oh, nope, not gonna do that. But I think that it's a great place to start culture change. I think that we can all understand that, from my perspective, as a practical matter, I understand that we are not ever going to stop consuming animals. I think that it's an unfortunate thing, but I think that that's the reality. So my goal is to reduce the amount of suffering that is occurring, and both the culture change that these laws can bring about, or just, it's a consciousness raising device to make people think about how their food is getting to their plate. And then also, even as a numbers game, if, the minimum care standards are only enforced for like small hobby farms in a state, well, then that means that all of those animals are suffering significantly less than they would be without those laws. So I absolutely do think that they're worth it for both of those reasons.
Yeah. She nailed it.
Follow-up to that, and again, given the great report that you and AWI put together, question for either of you, both of you, what role do you think that having that kind of data in the future can play, specifically in the farmed animal space, where, again, as has been a theme, not just for our panel, but throughout the day, where transparency is so rare?
Do you want to go for it?
Go right ahead.
Okay. I think that the data is important, obviously, to understand the question of whether or not it is worth the amount of time and the money and the effort to pass these laws. So how do we know that the time and the effort is worth it? And how do we, I think the data is especially important for determining how do we do better next time? How can we, write this law, and how can we tweak the language specifically to make sure that we're not running into the pitfalls that we see in the way that the laws are enforced. So, for example, the California law, it was very vague, the stand up, sit down, turn around without touching the sides of the enclosure. I think that I'm sure that there were strategic reasons for why that was used, because you have to give the people that are voting on these ballot initiatives kind of a visual in order to convince them to do it. But in the future, maybe being a little bit more prescriptive about what we do and do not allow, because unfortunately now at least for Prop 12 compliance or bans on gestation crates, there are new things called free access crates, where they essentially are locking. They're gestation crates, but the animal goes in and they can be locked behind the sow when she goes in. And theoretically, they're supposed to be able to push their way out as soon as they're done eating. But I mean, who's saying that the farmer isn't just keeping the lock on the crate? So just learning lessons. The data that we get is how we learn whether or not these laws are doing what we would like them to do.
Yeah, I'm always a little skeptical of data on stuff like that, because, what's the statistic? It's like 70% of people are like, I don't believe in animal abuse, right? And then, but yet most people do things that involve animal abuse with every meal that they eat, right? They just, they don't mean to, but they do. And so there's like this, I think we saw it with a recent election where we were trying to deal with people, and we were asking people, we're like, who do you want to vote for and what do you believe? And then people are saying things, and then we ran into this problem where we're like, well, wait, are you just saying that to me because you want to sound a certain way in front of me, but then when you're actually at the voting booth, you're going to do something else, right? Or you just convinced yourself in this moment that you believe that, but then when you go to the voting booth, it kicks in. And, it's like we all see this thing that people do where they're like, yeah, man, factory farming sucks and it's destroying the environment and there's all this animal cruelty. But you know what? I heard about this person that I heard like Chris Pratt really loves the animals that he raises and kills. So I'm going to go to McDonald's, right? And then they go and then they're getting a fast food. But now, like all this cognitive dissonance happened in this tiny space, but the end result is the same. And you see it in the companion animal movement when people are like, adopt or buy from a responsible breeder. Right, and there's all this stuff that gets said about, well, here's the red flag list to look out for to make sure the breeder's good. Cognitive dissonance gets in the way, and the red flags fall aside. Next thing you know, they're at the pet store, they're buying a puppy. Done. Right, and so I don't have the solution for that. I just I'm a little skeptical of the data. I hope that there's a way to increasingly narrow down that gap between what people say and what they mean, because that would help us a tremendous amount when trying to pass these laws.
Absolutely, and I think we can broaden that term data as well, just for this discussion to just information, right, about what's actually happening in these contexts. I think for sure all of us as advocates, whether we're pursuing a case in the civil and the criminal context in legislation, can benefit in our work for these animals and having more information. So we do have some time for some questions, and again, as Adrienne pointed out, we know we're the last panel standing between you and the bar and dinner, but does anyone have any questions at this point? You're free to come up to the mic, and I see we have one virtually.
Yes, we have a virtual question. My town sells goats and chickens in what looks like a storefront with covered windows. What type of laws govern live animal markets versus factory farms?
Depends. That's the most lawyer answer of all time. It depends on the state. There are some states, New Jersey has very specific live animal market laws. I'm assuming New York also does. I mean, unfortunately, because of the avian flu that's been going around, they're being a little bit more strict because those markets are a zoonotic disease nightmare. So I would say consult the Oracle is what I call Google, and you should be able to figure out exactly what your state regulates as far as live markets.
Yeah, and it depends if it's halal or kosher. It's going to make a huge difference on what you're looking for. Typically it's like you're going to be looking for the point of slaughter, and that's going to be determined by, like, even how the cut's done will determine. If that's a religious killing, that is a whole new set of things that you would use to your advantage in pursuing a cruelty case. Yeah.
I'm not sure which one of you is first.
What was your most bizarre experience in trying to get an animal cruelty law enforced?
Can you repeat the beginning of the question?
The most bizarre experience or story.
Okay. Shit. Wow. Okay. There's a bunch of them. But the most bizarre in trying to get a cruelty law enforced, I would say that a good one. I can't say that it's the most bizarre, but I think it really kind of highlights everything for me. Was this dairy case? It's just like this one is like so clean cut in the problem. It was this dairy case I had in Idaho years ago. It was another Mercy for Animals case. Where's Team MFA at? Woo! And it was called Betancourt Dairy, and there was all this cruelty and people beating the hell out of downed cows. And so like I walk in and it's day one. And the manager, like there were 6 sites for the Betancourt dairies, right? And this is just one of the sites. And so the manager is there, and there's a downed cow, and he has a handheld taser. And I review, and I'm looking at it, and he shocks her over 50 times in a short span of time, like in a minute. He just keeps shocking and shocking, and then puts a chain around her neck, drags her away, and the prosecutor decided to go after a bunch of the workers and not the manager. And I went to court, getting ready to testify right as someone pled out. And I asked the sheriff, he was there. I was like, hey man, why did you not recommend charges? Why did you only want charges against the workers and not against the manager? He was shocking that cow 50 times and dragged her away. And he said, that's what I do to cows that can't stand at my ranch. And like, that just like, that was it. That was the culture thing locked in for me at that moment. That's probably the most, besides that, man, I got a lot of stories. But that's a very clear-cut one, I think. Yeah.
Oh, I would just say it was really bizarre to have somebody from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture tell me very openly that they were forced to write those regulations and that nobody actually follows them. I appreciate his honesty, I suppose.
That's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
It's the same friggin' thing, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Do we have time for
One more question, I think we have time for.
I have a question for one for each of you, but have you guys done any studies on federal enforcement? I mean, there's not much, but the 28-hour law or other, have you guys done anything with AWI?
Yeah, so I think maybe a month or two ago, I released a report on the enforcement of the 28-hour law. Spoiler alert, it doesn't happen either. And then recently, AWI, we do a lot of public records requests. I feel like all I do is read FOIA responses, but we did one recently on, and we do them occasionally every 3 to 5 years on the enforcement of both the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and good commercial practices for poultry. So, you know, it's a pretty comprehensive look at least what the federal government will give us as far as enforcement goes. And those are on the AWI website, so I encourage you to look at those.
Yeah, I would just tell you real quick, on the enforcement end, it's completely different, totally different game. I've dealt with, I mean, obviously with APHIS, but as far as like federal agents, badge, gun, agent, right, like EPA, Food Safety Inspection Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I've dealt with all those agencies. NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service quite a bit. It's totally different. The mindset of a federal agent when they're working a case. So this would be like, for the cases that I had, the EPA had jumped on with APHIS on it was a puppy mill selling dogs to research. FSIS, that was a slaughter case. All the NOAA and service stuff was wildlife. It was commercial fishing. The mindset of the agents was not like local law enforcement. It was not like, oh, this is a community member and, you know, and they're a big taxpayer. The mindset was exactly like ours. It was, this is a target, and I'm going to work the target. Absolutely, totally different. Like, it was working with them in U.S. attorneys' offices has been like the greatest highlight of my whole career. And if you ever have an opportunity to get the feds involved, just like that target's done.
Thank you. I was curious how you focus the cases on the management versus the individual workers. Do you spin it in a certain way when you present it to law enforcement?
Well, so yeah, that can be done, but I've seen it where, you know, it tried to be presented in a way, and then I even had like a sheriff's department in Hattiesburg, Mississippi in 2014. A sheriff's deputy in Hattiesburg, Mississippi said to me, he was like, listen, you know, we agree with you, we're gonna try to go after the owners because all these workers, look, it's just unfair. These are all a bunch, like they're all disenfranchised, and, you know, they're victims of the system too. And I was like, oh man, you got it, right? But if you're worried, the DA didn't agree. If you're worried about presenting it so that they focus on the owner, it's too late. The evidence has to be on the owner. You gotta have the owner committing a crime or saying that, you know, the owner has heard you say that there's animals, that they're dying, and he doesn't care. Now, again, a federal case is kind of different. Like if it's commercial fishing boats or something like that, it's going to be the feds, it's going to be NOAA, it's going to be the service, depending on if it's mammals or seabirds, and they're hitting the captains. The captains are getting hit straight up. They don't care about the workers at all. Food Safety Inspection Service also, I mean, they were not at all focused on they wanted to go after the slaughterhouse owner and take him down.
And I'll just add the very lawyerly caveat to end us that in some states, we've seen that, you know, that ability to impute liability to a corporation will depend again, on that specific state. And sometimes there is more of a strict liability for the owner or entity, just given whatever other workers have committed. So that is our time for now.